On Primetime Politics tonight, the war in Ukraine has pushed Canada to confront its military capabilities and weaknesses. That will come into sharp focus at the emergency NATO meeting this week. I'll speak with this military expert about the challenges facing Canada. Pressure builds on the federal government to act quickly to end a work stoppage at CP Rail. I'll ask Canada's Minister of Labour how long the federal government's prepared to wait. And our panel of parliamentary journalists on Ukraine, budget priorities, and the Conservative leadership race. And we'll begin tonight with the work stoppage at CP Rail. The stoppage involving nearly 3,000 engineers, conductors, and other train employees took effect early Sunday morning after a lockout initiated by the Calgary-based railway. It's another hit to the supply chain in this country, still reeling from the pandemic and recovering from western floods last year and a global fertilizer shortage because of the war in Ukraine. And if the stoppage lasts for more than a few days, Canadians could see food prices jump even higher. In a moment, I'll speak with the Minister of Labour facing pressure to legislate an end to the stoppage. But first, some of that pressure is coming from the agriculture and food production sector.
Currently, we only have a 1 to 2 week buffer of feed in the system before we won't have any feed for our cattle. I would also note that there are not enough trucks available to transport the feed. It is estimated that over 1,000 Super B trucks would be needed weekly to replace the volume of feed grain currently being transported by CP trains, and trucking capacity is not available, leaving no alternative solutions. That is why we've been consistently urging the negotiating parties to reach a resolution, and today, following yesterday's work stoppage, have to ask the federal government to intervene and implement back-to-work legislation immediately.
The impact of this work stoppage compounds the particularly vulnerable position that farmers already find themselves in. Our agri-food system generates over $55 billion annually, but with the fallout from the war in Ukraine, our international customers require quick reassurance that a spring crop will go in the ground without delays caused by supply chain interruptions. The bottom line is that our members rely on this critical infrastructure to get our product to customers across Canada and around the world. Therefore, we are calling on the federal government to use any tool at its disposal to bring this disruption to an end.
Seamus O'Regan is Canada's Minister of Labour. He joins me now from Calgary, where the CP Rail negotiations continue. Minister O'Regan, first of all, thanks for taking your time to speak with me tonight. What can you tell us about where the talks are at right now?
They're in the thick of it. There's been, I guess, some drama that other people have seen on the outside, but I can tell you on the inside, these two parties are committed to the table. They are committed to the negotiating table. They've been there, and they are, hammering away at this. I take that as a very good sign. I never, ever take for granted that you'd have, the employer and the company, both at the table. One can always leave. That's their privilege and their right, but they have not. And so I take that as a very good sign.
Have you given the two sides a deadline?
No, I've just said to them I want a substantive deal, and I want it as quickly as possible. And I think that's pretty much the mood of Canadians, to be honest with you. As I've said on several occasions in the past couple of days, this work stoppage couldn't happen at a worse time. Between reeling from COVID and their supply chains backed up to the floodings that, occurred out in the West and still, backlogged a lot of things. And then you put on top of that the stresses and strains right now of a war in Europe. This couldn't be happening at a worse time, so I want a deal now.
Okay, so what does that mean? How long are you prepared to give the negotiations before you order an end to the stoppage?
One thing I've learned is that even speculating about that can have an effect on the table, and I am singularly focused on getting this deal. So even talking about, when, if, how long can affect the parties, can affect them and their ability to get a deal, and I am not doing anything to endanger that. So, I'm being a bit obscure, but I want to tell you there's a good reason for that. I am focused on the deal. Right,
but you've talked about how urgently a deal is needed, so I guess I'm wondering
exactly
why you're reluctant to act immediately when you know how much is at stake.
Well, I do know how much is at stake, but I also know that the best deals, the most resilient deals, so you're not coming back and doing this all the time, happen at the bargaining table between the two parties. The federal government has a very, obviously keen interest in this, and I commend our federal mediation and conciliation service, because these are professionals who are at the table and helping them wind their way through this and navigate through, and they are doing a commendable job.
Right.
And I congratulate the parties for sticking with it.
Right, but when you talk about the best deals, or the most resilient deals, are the ones achieved at the bargaining table. But what if that takes 2 weeks? What if that takes 3 weeks?
I want the deal to happen as quickly as possible.
Right, hours, days. I mean, that the stoppage is already getting noticed in the United States, surfacing more concerns there about the reliability of Canada's supply chain in this country. There's a lot riding on not just a deal, but the timetable around a deal and the urgency of one.
Oh, I'm keenly aware of it. I keep the U.S. ambassador to Canada updated. I've spoken on several occasions in the past couple of days with the U.S. Secretary of Labor. This is an integrated economy continentally, particularly our railway. And when we talk about supply chain issues in this country, it does have a big effect in the United States. So, being good partners, we have kept them updated. I personally keep them updated to make sure that they know, where things are. So, no, I'm very much aware of that, Peter.
Yeah, but I know you don't want to single to either side when you might be prepared to act as a government. But to the people who are concerned about the impact of this, and you've detailed the impact of this kind of a work stoppage, should they expect this thing to be resolved one way or the other by the end of the week even?
I don't want to put a time limit on it, and I won't, because I want a deal, and I want a deal as soon as possible. And I think that's what Canadians want. So, trust me when I tell you that, speculating wildly on when I want to see a deal happen, or speculating on when the deadline should be, will have an effect on at the table, and it will have an effect on getting a deal. And that's what we want. That's the permanent solution.
Can I ask you?
What can I tell you? I am, every time I do an interview on this, I am walking a tightrope, and I appreciate that. And I usually like having, far more frank answers for you. But I am singularly focused on getting that deal.
You know the concerns that have been expressed by farmers, producers, especially in the West, running low on feed and fertilizer.
Yeah, indeed.
And a lot of that moves by rail. So I'm sure they're wondering tonight, do you have a plan B idea for them?
I choose to be optimistic. And I am confident that I know that the best place to reach this deal is at the negotiating table with these two parties. And we are working day and night and day to make sure that happens.
Let's finish on this. You've chosen to stay in Calgary. You're there. Are you actually in on any of the negotiations? And what is your role there, and why do you feel the need to stay there?
Well, I haven't booked a flight home, so I'm not going to get ahead of myself. We have an extremely able, federal mediation and conciliation team. This is what they do. They are very good at it. I would probably make the argument the ministers of labor will come and go. These guys will know what they're doing, and they will, continue to see governments through moments like this. I frankly am quite struck by just the level of competence and professionalism that they hold, and they are respected by the other parties as well. They are well known and respected by them. These are the men and women to do the job.
But have you been in the room at any time?
I have been here to support them, and this is one of those situations where it's not about me; it's about getting the deal.
All right, Labour Minister Seamus O'Regan. Good of you to take the time tonight, Minister. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it.
Now let's turn to the war in Ukraine. The Russian invasion is forcing this country to rethink its role on the international stage and its commitment to military spending. First, the latest developments on the ground in Ukraine on day 26 of the Russian invasion. Ukraine rejected a demand from the Russians that Ukrainian forces surrender in Mariupol in return for safe passage out of the city. A Russian missile strike killed 8 people at a shopping center in Kyiv. Peace talks between the two sides yielded no concrete results again today. Ministers from the European Union met today and discussed how to get Europe off of Russian oil. NATO leaders, including Prime Minister Trudeau, will hold an emergency session on Thursday to discuss how to step up the response against Russia and step up the NATO deterrence forces in Europe. Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs says more sanctions are coming against Russia later this week.
we need to make sure that Ukrainians win this war. Vladimir Putin cannot prevail. This is a question that is existential to the West and to the world's stability. And so that's why we will do everything in our power to make sure that we can isolate economically, politically, and diplomatically Russia, and at the same time that we can continue to support Ukraine by providing more weapons and also more very difficult sanctions against Russia.
David Parry is the president of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He joins me now. David, good to see you again. Thanks for taking time to speak with me. Look, the Foreign Affairs Minister, Melanie Joly, said today that the West needs to make sure that Ukrainians win this war, that this is an existential question for the West. Do you agree with her, first of all? And if so, what more does NATO need to be doing to defend Ukraine?
Well, I certainly think, to her point, if we let Ukraine fail and have Russia conquer them, then that certainly sets just a tremendously horrible precedent going forward, not just in terms of what the Russians might do elsewhere, but what any other actor that wants to invade another country might take away as a lesson about Western indifference. In terms of what else the West might do, I think what we're likely to see, as we've been hinted at in the last couple of days, is some additional significant efforts to increase the Ukrainians' air defense capability. I think at this point, the Ukrainian army and the territorial defense units are probably on the point of being flush with arms for their army. On the air defense side, though, I think there's still some additional room for us to help.
So the question then becomes, at this point, is NATO really doing all it can to ensure that Ukrainians do win the war, since the NATO moves so far haven't slowed the Russian aggression?
Well, I would actually say that in the last couple of weeks, we've actually seen a significant slowing of Russia's military advance. And it's hard to attribute that to any one individual thing. But I think it's tough to think that the approaching 10 or 20,000 pieces of anti-tank, anti-armor weapons, in addition to a wide variety of other small arms, surveillance, intelligence support, isn't playing a significant role in that. I think NATO's trying to strike a very careful balance, though, between not having this conflict escalate further, recognizing that Russia is the second largest nuclear power on the planet, and therefore the risk of escalation with a regime that is both unpredictable, that is hugely more risk acceptant than we in the West are, and has also seen what's played out in Ukraine not at all go according to their plan. Those are all factors that make this a dangerous situation. So NATO's, I think, trying to be cautious in terms of how much support it gives and in what types of ways to prevent this from spiraling further out of control.
Do you believe NATO can continue to arm up the Ukrainian forces, provide them with better ground-air defense mechanisms and so on, without Russia viewing that as effectively NATO's direct involvement in the war?
I think at this point, the Russians do view it as NATO being involved in the war, but to this point, they've indicated, in terms of what they've done, that it's a type of involvement that they're willing to basically tolerate. There have been some clear indications from the Russians that, to the extent that they can, they're going to try and target that supply of goods when it crosses over the Ukrainian border. So I think that's part of the additional reason to want to keep as much as possible support going for Ukrainian air defense to prevent the Russians from being able to gain control of all of Ukraine's skies, which would be one of the things that they could use to do with that, if they were able to secure that advantage, would be to go after the shipments of arms that are flooding over the border from NATO countries into Ukraine. Keeping that support, keeping that supply of material going into the Ukrainian hands, I think is going to be vital to helping them be able to prosecute this and at least get the Russians to a stalemate.
All right, let me, if I can, pivot to greater attention to detail on what's happening with Canada. What has the war in Ukraine revealed about Canada's commitment to military spending and military preparedness?
I think if you use our own anti-tank, anti-armor weapons as a bit of a microcosm, it showed that while other countries have top rank, new technology weapons, both the Brits, both the Americans have, we have a version of that. The Carl Gustaf equipment, from what I understand, is fairly capable. It's just generations old technology. It doesn't pack as much of a lethal punch as the newer, shinier versions that other countries that have consistently invested more have in their inventory. And that's a bit of a microcosm into the state of the Canadian Forces writ large. It's not that we don't have capability in our Navy and our Air Force and the Army that can be effective. We just don't have anything resembling the latest and greatest like a lot of our allies do. Our ships are capable, but they're starting to turn 30 this spring.
Okay, I mean, let me ask. So as this conversation's become focused around, NATO discussion groups and NATO ministers and the Leaders Summit happening this Thursday, is it fair to characterize Canada as being in an embarrassing situation with what it is we're able to put up compared to other countries?
I don't think we're in the position that it's embarrassing because we do actually have real meaningful military capability and combat power that we can bring. It's just increasingly elderly, and the plans for arguably three successive governments going back to Paul Martin that have been engaged in the recapitalization, the rearming of the Canadian forces to make up from some of that decade of darkness from the 1990s. All that's going slower than we would ideally want it to be. And I think what we're seeing in Ukraine right now is that we are in a situation with great powers that have, in both China and Russia, that have invested very significantly in their military, have the ability today to do things that we don't like. But our ability to respond to those, as we are in Ukraine, has been conditioned by about a decade and a half now of underwhelming reinvestment. So it's not that we're in total crisis, but I don't think that where we are as a military meets the current moment and an era of great power competition, which we're seeing play out in Ukraine.
We've heard a number of ministers, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs again today, say it's clear Canada will have to ensure that our military is better equipped to meet the new threats we're facing. You look at countries such as Germany increasing military spending for the first time since the Second World War. Canada spends 1.4% of GDP on military. How high does that number need to go now?
Well, I think there's kind of two tracks to look at it. I think with other allies like Germany, like Denmark, making significant commitments to up their military spending, just the straight burden sharing discussion at NATO, which really, at least in the current context, orients a lot around the share of our GDP going towards defense. It's going to be much more difficult for Canada to go to those meetings and basically make the same kind of argument that we have been for years, that we may be falling far short of those spending targets, but we still do a lot elsewise, and that should count. The rest of the alliance is moving in a particular direction, so Canada's going to be left out a bit on that. Beyond that, I think we should be thinking of areas that we can invest that is in Canada's interest to do so. We can spend money on virtually anything that would fall under the military's purview, and that would count towards that target. So we should think about things that are in our own national interest. And I think top of mind should be a range of different investments related to continental defense, and beyond that in our Navy, given the Asian century that we're looking at.
All right, David Parry, always good to get your perspective. Thanks again for giving it to us tonight. David, take care.
Good to talk to you.
Let's bring in three colleagues now from the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Susan Delacourt's a columnist with the Toronto Star. Joël-Denis Bellavance is the Parliamentary Bureau Chief for La Presse. And Catherine Lévesque is a Parliamentary Reporter for the National Post. Good to see you all. Thanks for being with me today. Susan, look, we're expecting a federal budget within the next few weeks. How has the war in Ukraine and Canada's response and everything around that changed the conversation, do you think, inside the government over budget priorities?
Well, I think it's changed it outside the government, too. It's got now, we saw Anita Anand, I think, sort of negotiating on the outside of cabinet about why she needed more money for defense and to bring it up to Canada's NATO contribution up to 2%. I got the impression from the way her cabinet colleagues have been responding in interviews over the last week or so that has not been formally presented to cabinet. It may be tomorrow, but I think that that we're seeing that there's an argument that the world has changed forever because of this invasion, and therefore Canada's budget has to change forever. So I hope the budget wasn't at the printers already, because I think it's still being written.
Joël-Denis, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I agree. I think we're going to see the main theme of this budget will be military spending, and that will go a long way in trying to secure equipment that the National Defense the Department needs. Also, I think what we need to do is also at the same time reform our procurement policies, because we may have the money, but sometimes it's very slow in acquiring the equipment. It may take like 2 decades in some instances to buy the equipment you need. Like just think about the replacement of the CF-18. We're still looking for the planes. 2 companies are still, considered for this change. But clearly, I think what we have right now around the table, the cabinet table, is a majority of hawks. They want to see increase in spending for the military, and that we're going to see that in the next federal budget.
And Catherine, let me ask you, the country's facing spiraling inflation, housing costs out of reach for many young people in particular. Will there be a challenge of trying to sell Canadians on more money for defense, or has Ukraine changed, perhaps exposed a whole new reality that Canadians have to come to terms with?
I think the Liberals right now have too many priorities. I mean, we've seen all these campaign promises about housing, about the environment, and now comes this war in Ukraine and the invasion of Russia. But certainly, I think what we've been hearing from Canadians hasn't always been the case, certainly in the past few years, is a need for more investment in defense. I think the government now will have the support of a majority of Canadians, to increase our defense spending, because right now, I mean, the situation is ridiculous. We have very old planes, we have very old equipment. I mean, we've been trying to help Ukraine in however ways we can, but it's limited right now, and we obviously have to spend more money from now on for spending. But obviously, we won't see the results right away.
Right, Susan. Let me talk about the CP rail stoppage now. Once again, Canadian business leaders, a lot of them are down in Washington as we speak, trying to reopen the lines of communication after the pandemic, and here they are finding themselves defending the reliability once again of Canada's supply chain to some American legislators. How long do you think the government can go before it ends this?
Not long. I saw, like you did, I'm sure, the head of the Auto Parts Manufacturers Union, he said that within an hour of arriving in Washington today, that he had heard 4 times about the rail strike and that it had to end soon. Certainly you heard in question period, it was the majority of questions. So I think the pressure will be on the government to end this quickly. This is the worst timing for something like this. We just don't need any more disruptions in the supply chain, no matter which side of the strike you're on. Yeah. Or it's not. I guess it's the NDP is careful to say this is a lockout. Right.
There were lots of indications that there was trouble getting a deal in the past number of weeks, Joël-Denis. Is the government slow to react to this? And give me your thoughts on how quickly do you think Seamus O'Regan has to, bring an end to it? Oh, okay. Sorry, Joël-Denis frozen. So, look, Catherine, let me jump to you and ask you to answer that same question here in terms of timing for the government bringing an end to this work stoppage.
It has to be as soon as possible. I mean, I think Minister O'Regan was very clear in the sense that he is not leaving Calgary as long as this is not resolved, as long as there's not a resolution. I think all parties are right now at the negotiating table, which is a good sign. But at the same time, I mean, our reputation is on the line here. I mean, the Americans have had, talked to Canada and said, well, what happened with the trucker convoy? That certainly caused a lot of supply chain issues. I think we can't afford to have another conflict that will make us seen as a less reliable partner now. So Seamus O'Regan has no choice but to stay there until this is resolved, hopefully in a matter of hours or days. Yeah.
Susan, let me shift our focus now to the Conservative leadership race. 2 more candidates on the weekend, 2 MPs, Mark Dalton from BC, Scott Aitchison from Ontario. And then I thought some interesting news as well. Michelle Rempel Garner joining the Patrick Brown campaign as national campaign co-chair. What kind of a message do you think that sends? And is that a big get for Patrick Brown?
I think it is. I think it's a very big get. I think the assumption had been that Pierre Poilievre had that, the base of the Conservative Party wrapped up and in his hands. And Michelle Rempel represents a large part of that Western base. She's very popular. And the fact that she's gone to Patrick Brown instead of Pierre Poilievre tells us this race is getting even more interesting than it was already.
Joël-Denis, Michelle Rempel Garner going to the Patrick Brown campaign, but then within a matter, like it's hard to follow how quickly other camps respond to these news flashes from candidates and so on, but already getting assailed by Jenny Byrne from the Pierre Poilievre campaign saying, hey, look at Patrick Brown's record, allegations against him of sexual harassment in Ontario. What are you doing going to Patrick Brown? But tell me about that and Michelle Rempel going instead to Patrick Brown's camp and instead of to the Poilievre camp.
Well, as Susan just mentioned, the fact that Michelle Rempel chose Patrick Brown brings a lot of interesting dynamics to this race. But one thing that the Pierre Poilievre camp has to watch is that they're attacking everybody. So they run the risk of making sure that nobody will vote for Mr. Poilievre on the second round. It's a proportional ballot, so you have to make friends at some time in this race. If you attack the main other candidacies, you may not find yourself having enough support. So you may hit the ceiling of 45% on the first ballot, but find no support on the second ballot that will prevent you from winning this race. So Mr. Poilievre right now, his camp cannot pretend to be the candidate of unity within this race.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, Catherine, you see that you've got Jean Charest, Patrick Brown, Scott Aitchison from Central Canada, all talking about unity, all talking about the need to tone down some of the rhetoric and to unify Conservatives and to unify Canadians. And then you see the tactics of the Poilievre campaign. What do you make of that?
Well, I wouldn't say it's just coming from the Poilievre campaign. I mean, Patrick Brown is absolutely responding to these attacks, and he's actually going on the offensive as well. He released his platform for Western Canada. Even in there, he had some attacks towards Pierre Poilievre. So I think it's really interesting because just a few days ago, or even 2 weeks ago, Pierre Poilievre was attacking Jean Charest. Now he's focused all his attention to Patrick Brown. So I think it kind of talks to that strategy that, those possible talks between the Brown and Charest campaigns, whereas to look, is Jean Charest going to be try to look as the unifier, going to be like, look, I'm not going to respond to these attacks. Instead, what we're seeing right now are direct attacks between the Brown and Poilievre campaigns. And it's kind of interesting because especially that they served under the Harper government, they were sitting together. They were actually colleagues for many years. So I think most of the action, if you will be between those two campaigns. And but unfortunately, we've seen a lot of nastiness in the past few days.
All right, and the campaign's just getting underway. Lots of weeks to come. We'll see if that theme holds true. Thank you all for your time tonight. Take care. We'll talk again.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And that's all for another edition of Primetime Politics on CPAC. For all of us here at CPAC, I'm Peter Van Dusen. Thanks for watching. Until next time.